Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 15 of the Ask Historians podcast. 15 episodes thus far. Pretty soon, we'll be asking to borrow the keys and looking at boys. Today, however, we will be talking to AC7 about the Battle of France, which is, of course, the infamous period of what turns out to be just a couple weeks at the beginning of World War II, wherein Nazi Germany invaded France, who quickly capitulated, thereby earning them the cheese-eating surrender monkey moniker. Hopefully today, this will clear up some of the misconceptions that people have held about this time period, and if not, you will at least have a great show on your hands. We do have a few minor technical difficulties along the way in this one, unfortunately. I've done my best to edit them out, but if you are someone who is an audiophile who needs nothing but the finest gold-plated wires going directly into your brain, then I apologize in advance. Hopefully you'll be able to put that behind you and enjoy the episode.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Ask Historians. Today, I have with me AC7, which is going to call AC to make it easier. And we're going to be talking about, he's going to be talking about, and I'm going to be asking him questions, preferably when he has his mouth full or is trying to segue to a new topic, about the Battle of France, or I guess the fall of France to the Nazis in World War II. It's one of those topics in history that I think a lot of people, given the broader context of World War II and the kind of momentous, literally world-changing event that it might get glossed over. And also, cheese-eating surrender monkeys. This is where that reputation, I would guess, it would come from. But AC, why don't you give us a little prelude to how exactly this whole thing got started? Why were the Nazis gunning over towards France to begin with? What was happening?
Well, I was actually discussing this with a few of the other World War II experts on the site, and I was trying to think of, where do I start? It's such a broad topic, and it's generally a topic with, compared to something else like less, more obscure, like Japanese pirates or whatever topic you want to bring up. So everyone has basically a working knowledge, I think, of World War II. I mean, by the time you're out of elementary school, you have a working knowledge of the events. So it's kind of hard to where you want to start basic, but you don't want to, baby people, because I think everyone knows about Poland, and that. So I figured I'd just gloss over, the first part of the war with the whole Austria and Czechoslovakia. Everyone knows that. And I think I'd start with the fall of Poland, because the fall of Poland is really the beginning of the end for France, because right now the Nazi war machine is completely turned towards France. There's no one else standing in France's, that France can use to pull pressure off, all towards France. So Hitler didn't actually want to attack the West. He had always just sort of wanted to say, leave me alone. I'll go do what I want to do against Russia. And he'll say, just leave me alone. And he kind of thought, hey, you guys hate Russia, I hate Russia. Why don't we all just sort of go
and conquer Russia?
You guys leave me. I can. Let me just take care of them. And then, but they weren't going to do that. They didn't want a hostile mega Germany on their borders. So
how does that tie in? And we can probably cover this more in depth later. But how does that tie into kind of the non-aggression pact that Stalin and Hitler then later signed? How did we get from Hitler wanting to conquer Russia to Hitler saying maybe France first?
Well, the non-aggression pact, you have to look at it in more of it was sort of both sides kind of came to like a giant light bulb came over their head saying, wait a minute, we don't want to fight just yet. So, we could probably work together for a few months. Hitler had always intended for the non-aggression pact to sort of be let me, buy a few years while I deal with what I need to do. Stalin needed it more than Hitler, though. Stalin's army was a mess. So both sides figured, we can use this to our advantage.
And they had one particular thing in between them, of course, which was the nation of Poland.
Yes, both of them hated Poland. It's honestly, you could do a toss-up between who hated it more, Stalin or Hitler. Both thought of it as just like it shouldn't exist, right? Stalin called it like the failure of Versailles, and Hitler called it a nation of dogs and vermin, and they both just hated it. So they both thought.
I'll make sure to pass that on to my bocce next time I see her. It's a Polish joke for those who don't know it. Yeah.
So, anyways, as Poland fell, I don't want to say that Poland didn't really put up a fight, because they did. They inflicted a lot of losses on the Germans, but they weren't like, no one could have known what the Germans had planned, this new lightning war with new types of planes and tanks that just, the Polish weren't, like, the Polish had one tank division, and that was it, and it wasn't even fully done yet. Like, they had no chance. But
did they have any air support, air force?
They did have a decent air force, but Nazis, because of the nature of their attack, they managed to catch it mostly on the ground. And again, it was a thing where the Polish did inflict some casualties on the Luftwaffe, but ultimately they just were too out of date, couldn't do anything. So Poland falls in a month, which, funny enough, is actually, it takes longer for the Nazis to conquer Poland than to conquer France, despite France being arguably far more prepared.
Yeah, one thing that I've heard, and I think this is kind of a nationalistic myth that gets used by both sides, both the Germans and the Polish, to kind of support their own ideas of themselves in this period, is the of Polish troops charging tanks on horseback.
Funny story about that. That didn't happen. Like, the Poles didn't just happen upon a tank and say, hey, our lances would work well against that, 6-inch thick armor. What happened was, Polish cavalry in this era was still used by both the French and the Polish, and even then the Germans too. So they were used mostly as just a screening sort of what's up ahead force. So a Polish cavalry reconnaissance unit hit some Germans who were resting resting at an area. So they fell back and called back tank support. Now, the Polish didn't actually charge it. It's just, they got caught in the crossfire when the tank support came back up, which is where that story comes from.
So it was more just kind of like, they were correctly doing their scouting job. They just couldn't get away from the tanks fast enough.
Yeah, essentially.
So Poland falls quite rapidly, and then I believe the next kind of time period we have, I've heard it called the Phoney War at this point.
Yes, it's also known as the Sitzkrieg as opposed to the Blitzkrieg, which is another. It's just amazing if you look through all these names, how many of them just come from wisecracking journalists trying to be funny. Like, American journalists gave the name the Sitzkrieg. Yeah, and so anyways, not a lot happens on the actual Western Front. The only thing the French did was a small thing called the Saar Offensive, and it was basically them marching into an area saying, all right, we did our job, come back, because Poland had obviously been wanting France and Britain to launch an assault because they couldn't handle Germany alone. But France didn't want to do that because that wasn't France's plan, which I'll talk about later. They had a very set battle plan that they refused to deviate from, and that would be their undoing. But so they're like, okay, we marched some cavalry and some infantry into this small, unimportant area. Let's turn back. We did our job. Good job.
It was kind of a token thing to be like, okay, yes, we'll do something, but we had this really big plan, guys. Trust us.
Yeah, that was essentially it. And Poland got screwed essentially by the Soviets coming in, because Poland had always just sort of planned to sit in their eastern part, which was the Pripyat marshes, which would have been impossible to attack into. And their plan was kind of just to shelter there until France did something. But
yeah, marshes are never quite. Usually, when you hear marshes, you don't think rapid advance of militaries.
Yeah. With Poland down, Hitler immediately started planning for an offensive against the West. Like, he wanted France done by Christmas of 1939, and that's a common theme with Hitler, is he puts his invasion dates way too early. Like, when he went and told the OKH, which was the German High Command, and I'm going to refer to it as the OKH exclusively because I refuse to say its German name, I'll just butcher it. Like, I couldn't even begin to say it, but he goes and tells them, I want the offensive set for November 12th of 1939, and they all just kind of looked at him and said, you're kidding me, right? Everyone's in the east. It would take at least 3 months to move them west. So
are the German troops in Poland at this point having to deal with like a Polish resistance, or that kind of more coalesce into something more solid later?
That's more later, because the main Polish resistance group, the Home Army as they're called, didn't form until 1942, 1943 type area. Like, there was local areas maybe of some resistance, but it's with how the Nazis sort of conducted war, there's a lot of terror. So people at the start are more just, okay, they won. We'll give them a bit to cool down, like, you know.
Yeah, so Poland has kind of been almost literally smashed at this point.
Yes. It also doesn't help that Hitler and Stalin both unleashed their secret police in force, like the SS and whatever the Soviet equivalent would have been, the NKVD
at this point. I don't actually know.
Yeah, it was the NKVD. Anyways, they unleashed them, and anyone who could have possibly posed a threat was immediately taken away. Like, there was no chance.
So what were the motions and the preparations that were going on with both the French and the Nazi troops at this point, preparing for this, Christmas 1939 date?
Well, anyways, so the plan for the Germans is probably one of the more interesting stories of the war, actually. So Hitler orders his men to start prepping for an offensive, and there's a few, like, small campaigns in between, obviously Denmark, Norway, but those are never really major ones. So the fall of France is going to be the next major campaign, and he orders his men to start planning it. And they come up, the two people involved in the planning are guys named Walter von Brauchitsch and Franz Halder. And Hitler wasn't a fan of them because they were, as he put it, sort of a quibbler and a doubter. Like, they were always saying, this won't work, I don't agree with this, and he doesn't like them, but he's got to work with them. So they come up with the most unambitious plan of all time. Their plan is essentially to repeat the Schlieffen Plan from World War I, but they don't even want to go all the way. Their plan is literally to just stop halfway and hope to God they can hold their positions while Germany captures air bases from which to bomb France and Britain.
So just for people who aren't up on their World War I, can you give us a very quick rundown of what is the Schlieffen Plan?
The Schlieffen Plan is all the German armies line up, I guess clockwise almost, from the French border all the way up to the Belgian border, sweep through Belgium, and go and sweep around and capture Paris. So basically, that's exactly what the Germans are going to do again, except they're going to stop a little short of capturing Paris. So
not charge all the way in, but kind of charge, get a defensive position.
Yeah.
And is this is the thinking of those two, the quibbler and the doubter, is the thinking by them at this point kind of more of a World War I thinking, where they think they're going to charge in and get bogged down in years of trench warfare? Are they doubting the new Blitzkrieg tank offensive?
What they're more doubting is their ability to win. They were deeply affected by World War I. They thought, okay, we're going to get bogged down in trench warfare no matter what we do. We might as well be as cautious as possible while doing it. So they proposed this to Hitler, and Hitler doesn't like it, but he says, it's the only one we got. You're the only people I've got who can actually do anything, so all right, we'll put this in, and he tentatively sets it for November 12th. But obviously, his men talk him into pushing it back till 1940. Luckily for the Nazis, unfortunately for the rest of us,
I think the phrase "luckily for" is going to be a very relative thing at this point.
But luckily for the Nazis, there's another man who doesn't like the plan, and he is the chief of staff of Army Group A, which is one of the bigger German army groups, and his name is Erich von Manstein. He hates the plan, so he starts working on his own, and he had what's called the sickle stroke, which is probably his greatest achievement, which is, I think everyone can guess what it is. The Germans will go through Belgium a la World War I, but as the Allies go into Belgium to meet them, the main German tank force will cut behind them, cutting them off and destroying them. So he comes up with this plan, and he refers to it as Case Yellow or Fall Gelb. And he tries to propose it to he takes it to Franz Halder. Now Franz Halder doesn't like it. He thinks it's a suicide mission. He says, bugger off, go do something else. But Manstein keeps working at him till eventually they do. Franz Halder gets so mad he can't deal with him anymore. He gives him a promotion to his own army unit, corps, it's called. But the problem is the corps is located in Poland in occupation duty, so it's their way of sort of saying, here's your promotion.
Lost.
Yeah, go do your own thing over there. So that should have been the end of it, but there's something working in his favor in that he is friends with one of Hitler's attendants, a guy by the name of Rudolf Schmutt, who's one of Hitler's bodyguards and friends. So he manages to get the plan to Rudolf, and Rudolf likes it. So he arranges a personal breakfast with Hitler. And he goes in and he proposes to Hitler, and Hitler's a very aggressive, a very, I want to risk everything kind. He's a gambler, and he loves the plan.
This appeals to his idea of getting it done quick and in one stroke.
Yeah, he loves it, and he loves it so much that he steals it and then goes and presents it to Franz. Yeah, Hitler was not a fun guy to work for. He would just take
are you
your
telling
ideas.
me that Hitler may not have been a good person?
I know. I just ruined Reddit's perception of him.
Shocked.
But he goes and up to Franz Halder and he says, "All right, guys, this is the plan. I liked it. I came up with it. Manstein kind of helped. He kind of just sat back there. I came up with the plan, and so obviously now Franz Halder can't do anything. Nor can Walter von Brauhitsch. They got their hands tied behind their back. But they even went as far as thinking about killing Hitler because they're so unconfident in this plan, but they never went past a thinking stage, so no one got punished really. So they eventually say, you know what, we'll try it. If it fails, it fails, because they got nothing else to do, right? So they institute Case Yellow, and here's the general idea of Case Yellow. Army Group B, under a guy named Fedor von Bock, would invade the Netherlands and Belgium and draw the Allied armies into Belgium. And then Army Group A, under a guy named Gerd von Rundstedt, and Manstein is his chief of staff, he has the majority of the panzers. He'll drive through the Ardennes and cut them off at the English Channel. And meanwhile, there's one last army group called C, under a guy named Wilhelm von Lieb. And he has the most pointless job. He's given, the least amount of men. He's given all the old weapons. His job is basically to sit in front of the Maginot Line and say, "I'm here. You guys can't do anything yet." So he has the most pointless job. But
so did the I've actually kind of wondered this. Did the Germans have their own kind of counterpart to the Maginot Line? Did they have their own series of fortifications at that point?
Yes, they had what's called the Siegfried Line, or the West Wall, which was directly opposite of the Maginot Line, and it extended all along the Rhine. And it was built starting 1934. It wasn't as extensive as the Maginot Line, but they were fairly extensive. They were extensive enough to halt the Allies' advance when they invaded Normandy in 1944.
Mm-hmm. So basically, Army Group C at this point is supposed to kind of sit on the Siegfried Line and make sure that the French can't counterattack through that way.
Yeah, and I'll actually get to why they couldn't do that and why. I'll go over that later when we get to the Maginot Line eventually, but I'll go over why. Yeah, so Army Group C got the job. That's, he's given all the old men who are just about to, retire, or the young recruits. He has no power whatsoever. So that is the plan. And then there's one other important event that leads to the death of the old plan and the implementation of Manstein's plan. It's what's called the Mechelen incident. The plan had been sent out to the various German embassies so they knew what to do, but the plane carrying the embassy, the plans to the embassy in Belgium.
And this is the old plan, right?
Yeah, the old plan. And it crash landed in northern Belgium. They weren't sure if the Allies had gotten the plan.
But they weren't sure they hadn't got the plan either.
Yeah, that's the issue. They hadn't been able to burn it in time, so basically they're like, okay, now we can't do it. So that's how the Germans sort of got their plan. With their plan set up, the Germans were basically done. It was just a matter of moving their men west. The French, meanwhile, had been getting ready for war as well, but the French plan is a bit more, it's definitely less ambitious, and it's definitely more of it's so rooted in World War I, almost to the point of absurdity how just World War One-esque it is. It's what's called the Dial Plan. For those who don't know, the Dial is a river in Belgium. It's one of the major rivers. So the plan was, as soon as Germany declares war, we rush into Belgium and take up defensive positions so that Germany can't rush to Belgium.
So kind of stop the Schlieffen plan before it schlieffs.
Yeah, and it's also got a bit of a sort of almost, I don't know what the word is, maybe scummy approach to it, because it basically amounts to, we don't want Frenchmen to die in an occupation, so we'll just fight on Belgium to ensure that Belgians die the most instead of us.
So very much informed by World War One at that point, then.
Yes, at that point, France just wants to avoid any destruction on their territory, and basically the French plan was, we'll sit on the Dial, and Britain will starve out Germany until Germany's weak enough that we can sort of, march over them easily enough.
Via naval brigade, of course, right?
Yeah, like naval blockade. Britain would, it was assumed that it would be a repeat of World War One. And that's now, I guess, a good time as any to get to the Maginot Line. That was the thinking behind the Maginot Line, was to say, okay, you have to attack through Belgium. You can't penetrate this Maginot Line. So, tough luck, got to attack through Belgium. The main flaw, as I've said before, maybe on Reddit if someone has seen it, with the Maginot Line was it was almost overkill, because the Maginot Line was so extensive that it had the effect of trapping men inside. So when the Manstein plan got told to all the various generals, the guy in charge of Army Group B, Fedor von Bock, he raised a very good point. He said, what is stopping the men in the Maginot Line from just attacking the tanks as they cross through the Ardennes? Little did the Germans know that that's not possible because of the design of the Maginot Line. You can't advance through, the men in the Maginot Line can't attack it. So that was probably the major flaw.
So it's kind of, I guess the defensive equivalent of the World War One, where Franz Ferdinand was sewed into his suit, and that actually caused him, that contributed to his death. Because
almost,
couldn't get the suit open. Yeah, so it's
securing
yourself a little too well. And I would guess presumably there was a great deal of men actually who needed to be on that line.
Yeah, that was another problem. Some of France's best men were on this line, and at a time when France, we'll get to it later, but France was having a major manpower crisis, and it just wasn't smart to put this many men onto a line, especially one that wasn't really ever going to be attacked. So it's a lot of hindsight, but overall the Maginot Line just didn't seem that effective. It was too much in a way.
So about the manpower shortage, France at this point had extensive colonial holdings.
Yes.
Were they at that point kind of planning on calling up colonial troops or bringing home French troops from colonial areas?
Yes, France had about 101 infantry divisions when Germany invaded.
For the civilians among us, about how many men is that?
That's that's about 1 million if you count in all the support troops and whatnot. It'd probably be around more closer to like around 500,000 actual fighting men. But if you count everyone who's actually working in the military, it'd be around 1 million or so.
Okay.
And not all of them were good quality, but among them there were several colonial divisions, and everyone knows about the North Africans. They get talked about a lot as France's colonial divisions as the North Africans, but there was others. There was men from Madagascar. There was men from Indochina who would be be very much responsible for trying to dent the German advance. They were some of the bravest soldiers out there. And there was men from sub-Saharan Africa who, unfortunately, they didn't fare too well when the Germans caught them. But it's one of the least talked about parts of France's military history, is just how much their colonial troops contributed. Yeah, it is unfortunate because it does get overlooked, and especially their contributions in Free France.
So with these two armies kind of sizing each other up, and I assume that this is what gets called the the Sitzkrieg, is the fact that all these the two armies are basically moving into position. So at that point, when does the actual invasion start?
The Germans had set the invasion plans for May, and it got delayed a few more times, but eventually the day was set for May 10th, and Hitler was like, not a single day later. So, starting on May 9th, the outposts in Belgium and the Netherlands started reporting to their men, or to their governments, that, hey, we're starting to see a lot of Germans on the border. It's like, what do you guys think is going on? And I mean, it was fairly obvious that it was an offensive, but both Belgium and the Netherlands were kind of saying maybe they won't involve us. So there wasn't a general panic. The Belgian embassy in Berlin was the first ones to break news of the attack. They decrypted the German plans and sent them to their government, but it was too late. By the time the warning got there, the German spearheads were already crossing the border into Belgium. And in the Netherlands, is where paratroopers were came into effect. Paratroopers were beginning to be dropped in large numbers on Belgium and the Netherlands. On Belgium had always relied on great forts. The Germans landed glider infantry on top of them and actually sealed the defenders inside these great fortifications the Belgians had relied on. And they also began to invade the Netherlands. Now, the Netherlands are an interesting case, and it's very unfortunate for them. They were neutrals in the First World War, and they really wanted no part in any war. They were the definition of unprepared. They hadn't fought a war against another European country since 1830, so they were in no way, shape, or form ready for this. The only reason they got invaded is because they have a small strip of territory known as Maastricht, and it offers an easier way around Belgian waterways. So they were invaded almost entirely because it was just easier to go through them than go around them.
So Belgium gets invaded because it's easier than going through France's Maginot Line, and the Netherlands get invaded because it's easier than going part of Belgium.
So essentially it's just one long left turn almost into France. So the Dutch basically do what they've always done when they've been invaded, and that's retreat to this small area in between, stretching from Rotterdam to Amsterdam. It's their waterlogged zone, so if anyone tries to invade, they can sort of flood the areas. There's canals. It's really hard. Fortunately, it worked really well when the Spanish invaded in 1600s, 1500s. Doesn't work so well in a modern sense. Modern European wars, they found out when the Germans simply just landed more paratroopers behind their canals that they were planning on defending. And so basically now the French are sort of hearing what's going on, so they send their armies into position. There's only one army that's meant to aid the Dutch. It's called the 7th Army under a guy named Henry Girard, and he was unable to. His job was to go basically delay the Germans in the Netherlands. He wasn't able to do anything though, the Dutch were basically too unprepared. Once he got there, the Germans had already taken over, so he had to retreat back into Belgium.
So too little, too late, essentially.
Yeah, and the Dutch didn't actually surrender yet. What happened was the Germans gave them an ultimatum. They said, surrender or we'll destroy one of your cities. Now the Dutch actually signed an armistice, but the Germans didn't send there's two schools of thought. Either they tried to send the recall signal and it didn't work, or they just didn't do it for as a sort of to make an example of them. But either way, the Germans didn't call off their bombers they were sending at Dutch cities, so they ended up destroying the city of Rotterdam, killing about 800 people. And at that point the Dutch had to surrender. Like they had signed an armistice, but they hadn't actually laid down their arms. So the Germans completely just flattened Rotterdam, and then the Dutch had to surrender. And their queen, by the name of Wilhelmina, fled into exile in Britain. So that was the end of the Dutch. Now the Belgians would actually last till like a few days before the French surrendered. So they put up a bit more fight. Anyways, the French were springing into action now. Just to recap, the Germans had just taken out the Netherlands, and now they're advancing into Belgium. And the Belgians aren't putting up as much of a fight as the French hoped. The French were kind of hoping the Belgians could, sacrifice themselves so that the French and British Expeditionary Force, which had just arrived, could get into position. But the Belgians retreated too fast, so what happened was the French had to sort of deny them, slow the Germans down. So they sent out a small tank army under a guy named General Prelude. And this was one of the first tank battles in European history, actually. One tank-on-tank battles, as General Prelude runs straight into 2 German armored divisions. And so it's basically at a small village called Hanau. And this is one of the few defeats the Germans are going to have at the hands of the French, as the French actually hold the Germans and manage to delay them long enough for the French to get in place. The Germans ended up losing less tanks, but the French basically did their job. So where we're at now is that the French are in position. And so everyone's kind of relieved. They're thinking, okay, we got into our positions, we're good. The French generals they're in great spirits. The chief of staff, sort of the French army, like for the Americans out there, it'd be equivalent of the joint chief of staff type position. He's humming. He's big. He's dancing around his headquarters. He's happy. Basically, in his mind, we've won because we've got them. They can't penetrate the river, and so the Allies are actually in great spirits. They're a little. The spirit of the Allied armies is they're confident they're going to win, but they're tired because they're like, do we really have to fight Germany again? We just did this 20 years ago, right? So.
But of course, at this point, the dial plan is working, so they figure, okay, we've learned from our mistakes in the past. Yeah, it's just that it's the idea that the military is always fighting the war they just lost or something like that.
Yeah. So everyone's in high spirits, and they're like, okay, this is where. However, unknowing they just sort of realize now. Wait a minute. This was a trap, wasn't it? Because immediately the Germans, who had piled all but one of their Panzer Corps, they organized their Panzer divisions into Panzer Corps, who were then under commands of Panzer groups. It's a very confusing system, but basically the Germans had massed all their Panzers on the Ardennes border, and the French now are just getting word that the Germans are streaming through the Ardennes, and they're like, basically, the reaction is, oh, crap. So
essentially, the dial plan goes into effect and immediately fails.
Yeah, essentially, because they basically get outflanked. And the Germans now, the Panzer Corps, are running through, but the French are still in this weird sense of, we can't decide what to do. On the one hand, this could just be a diversion to get us to leave our plan, to leave our positions on the Dial River. Or it could be the main attack, and no one knows what to do. So they kind of make the decision to half-heartedly attempt to stop them. They don't move any of their armies that are on the Dial. They send their reserve armies. Problem is they only have 2 low-quality armies to throw in to these elite German panzers. The panzer groups, I have them here, were streaming through. There's, just for those who are maybe interested in the order of battle, there was 41st Panzer Corps under a guy named George Reinhardt, headed for a small town known as Montherem. Further north was the 15th Panzer Corps under Hermann Hoth, headed for the town of Dignat. And there was Heinz Guderian, who was heading for Sedan, which is where the French had faced defeat years before in the Franco-Prussian War. So obviously,
a lot of symbolism there.
Yeah, and the goal of each Panzer Corps was to cross the major river that protects France, known as the Meuse, or the River Meuse. Basically, once you get
French is not my strongest suit either, so I'll
yeah,
take your word for it.
Yeah, it's not mine, trust me. So, anyways, the River Meuse or whatever, it's the only great barrier into France. There's the River Somme, but that's nowhere near as major. So if they get past the Meuse, it's over. So they begin streaming towards the various areas to try and get over the Meuse, and they're streaming through the Ardennes, but at a very slow pace because there's only 4 roads that lead through the Ardennes. So the panzers are just bumper to bumper, and it's ridiculous. It's like,
what kind of resistance are they facing at this point?
Next to none. There are there's some small garrison divisions there, but the French hadn't really expected the Germans to try anything major, so they hadn't really put anyone. There's 2 armies available that they can use, the 2nd and the 9th, I believe. Anyways, either way, none of the armies they can send are of really high quality, so Germans are going through the Ardennes, and some historians have jokingly referred to this as Europe's first traffic jam, as it's bumper to bumper. And if there had the French and British been able to bomb this, it would have been like a turkey shoot. But the German Luftwaffe at this point was so far ahead of the Allied air forces, it was ridiculous. The Germans held total air superiority. They could strike at will. That they easily just destroyed the French and British air forces. So the first major battle, if you will, is Heinz Guderian, who had the shortest route to Sedan. He arrives there on May 12th. He tries to get across the river, but the French do have artillery, so that makes it a bit more difficult. And the French do put up a decent resistance, given that they're fighting for their homeland now. So there's an extra bit of anger and sort of will into the fight. This is where air power, though, really comes back to bite the French, is the Germans launch what I'm sure everyone is familiar with, their Stuka dive bombers, and just wave after wave of these Stukas just pound the French. The French try their best, but anytime they try and move, you hear that siren sound on the Stukas, and they just go running because there's nothing they can do.
So this is kind of like highly mobile artillery.
Yeah, this is it is. The Stuka is essentially it's what's called it's one of the first sort of close air support type planes for those out there who are maybe looking for modern comparisons. It's able to it's artillery. They can pick where they want to strike with high precision. So Guderian is able to cross, and he's the first one to cross in major sort of like a major force, but he's not actually the first one to cross. That honor belongs to the 7th Panzer Division, which crossed further north at a small village named Hoot, which is near Digne. The 7th Panzer Division made a stealth crossing, so there weren't really a lot of them, which is why most people will say Guderian was the first to cross. But 7th Panzer Division made a stealth crossing. The commander of this division, he wasn't really famous. No one knew him. But, pretty soon I think everyone would know the name Erwin Rommel. But, yeah.
I may have heard of him, yes.
Yes, I spent like a good 5 minutes trying to come up with like a cool introduction for him. But, he managed to get his men across. Eventually everyone gets across. Despite some resistance, everyone gets across. The French win absolutely nowhere.
So what are the French kind of now trying to pivot down to try to stop this or assault through the Ardennes?
Amazingly, no. There's still so much division in the French high command that there's still so many people who think that this is just a feint, that the Germans are really coming through Belgium still, and they don't pivot down. They use those reserve armies we were talking about to try and stop them, but the French right now, this is where that manpower shortage is starting to come into effect, because the French are having trouble finding people to launch counterattacks. Right now, the Germans have established bridgeheads, but they're very weak because they haven't gotten all their tanks across. So the French are sort of looking, okay, who wants to attack? And they're like, we can't find anyone to actually attack. So they start assembling men. They start assembling their tank divisions. The French did have a few tank divisions, not as many as the Germans, but they did have them. The tanks they had were of actually very good quality. The Suma 35 tank that the French used was considered the best tank in the world. But the problem is they just didn't have that many of them, and they just didn't use them effectively. That was another major issue with the French army, was that they just didn't know how to use this stuff. It was still sort of foreign to them.
Yeah,
but
one of the things that I've of course absorbed through osmosis of this topic is, of course, when I heard you say, Guderian, I thought, oh yeah, the guy, who invented modern tank warfare, which is probably not entirely true, but I think there is
there had been several influential thinkers, including even a French general who had sort of pioneered France's armored program, and he was still quite influential, but the French hadn't taken to it as Guderian. Guderian was at this point so popular and so influential that he was essentially untouchable, whereas the French, they still relied on their infantry and whatnot.
So, if Guderian said, hey, we use the tanks this way, the tanks got used that way. If this French counterpart said, use the tanks this way, he may get ignored.
Yeah, or they debated him, and he had to go through all this. Where if Guderian says this is what needs to happen, everyone's like, "All right, well, Guderian said it." And everyone drop what you're doing.
One more interruption, and then we'll get back to the main thrust of this narrative. So, when we talk about the lack of French manpower, are we talking about a actual lack of population, or are we talking about a lack of men of military age? Are we talking about a lack of men in the military? What are the relative populations that we're looking at here?
The actual demographics are not like France wasn't as populous as Germany, so it was just a general manpower issue. Like the Germans were able to put around 118 infantry divisions on to the French border, while still at the same time garrisoning Poland with quite a few. Whereas the entire French army was only 101 infantry divisions. So. And that's including the colonial ones. So France definitely was lagging behind in just general men. Like, they couldn't find anyone. I guess you could just say military age, but even then, the French weren't above using 40, 50-year-olds to fight when things became desperate. So it wasn't even necessarily a military age, just so much as we can't find anybody. So anyways, the Germans have established their bridgeheads now, and the French are gearing up for a counterattack. And this is where the German command strength sort of comes in, and where the French command starts to break down. The problem with the French command system is everyone had a say almost. It's like you have the top general, he's got his HQ in this location. Then you have this general, his HQ is like 80 kilometers this way. Another guy's HQ is this way, and they all have to communicate with each other, and it's just really inefficient, whereas the Germans have a very rigid system that they had inherited from Prussia, their Prussian ancestors, and it was very efficient, as I'm sure most people know Germany generally is. Just very efficient.
That is the stereotype that I've heard, yes, once or twice.
Plus, there was divided loyalties, where the British commander, he was technically under the command of the French, but every order he was given, he first checked it out with London first, because he answered politically to them. It's just a mess. And the guy, General Alphonse Georges, was commander of all French field armies, and you kind of got to feel bad for him. He doesn't have the stomach for it anymore. As soon as he hears that the Germans have broken through the river Meuse, he starts crying. He breaks down. He cries, and one of his aides has to come over and says, okay, there's losses in warfare. And what he says to him, he says, everyone takes losses in warfare. Let's look at the map. Let's see what we can do to try and stop. So they finally get him to calm down, and they order some counterattacks. So the problem is, in all this delay, the Germans have reinforced. The first one they try and target is Guderian, the most threatening one, because he's got the biggest sort of force, and he's at the most dangerous area. It's a dump. Guderian here is where Guderian becomes, almost a legend of sorts. He splits up his men. He sends 2 tank divisions deep into France, and while the French are sort of regrouping, he then attacks them. He follows the strategy of the best defense is a good offense, and he just, as they're trying to get ready to attack him, he surprises them and just takes them out and sends the French force that was supposed to attack him reeling backwards. The French try then Erwin Rommel's bridgehead, But again, they run into issues. They've given him too much time. They attack him, and, well, he basically fends it off easily. So now the issue is, okay, the counterattacks have failed. Now it's time for Germany to strike out. Basically, because the Germans have sort of exhausted the French now, it's a really, really simple affair. The Germans strike out of their bridgeheads. They basically maul any French armies in front of them. And Guderian's the most... it's a common theme of Guderian doing most of it, but Guderian's the most important one in this, because he has the job of sealing the French off. So Guderian rushes forward, and on May the 18th, I believe, he hits the town of Aberville. And Aberville is on the Somme. And basically, once he reaches Aberville, that's it. The French are completely cut off now. The French and British are cut off in Belgium.
And so how many, what is are we talking about the whole, 100 infantry divisions trapped up in Belgium along with British troops there were?
The French had, there were 2 French armies, which, armies are impossible to nail down. Like, it goes, army group, army, division, corps, division, basically in the military structure. But everyone kind of had a different army structure, so there's no way to sort of determine how many men were in each army, but generally speaking, 2 French armies and the British Expeditionary Force were trapped inside this pocket. And the problem was that the French armies that were trapped were the cream of the crop. They contained, the best French mechanized divisions, their motorized divisions, and it contained the British allies. And the British had sent basically their entire army to France. So the entire British army is essentially trapped. Not to mention, as the Germans were closing the pocket, they basically destroyed those 2 reserve armies I had mentioned earlier that had been sent to try and stop them. The French 9th Army and the French 1st Army the French 2nd Army, I apologize, had been sent to try and stop the Germans, and the Germans had just mauled them. Like, the 9th Army basically ceased to exist. They couldn't find half the men. They just deserted, and the other half were completely destroyed. And the French 2nd Army had taken several casualties and couldn't do anything. So the cream of the French army is now trapped in Belgium, and the Germans sort of pause now. They've got them in, and Hitler at this point, once he hears that they're trapped, he is going nuts. He is happy. Hitler, it's a little known fact, but when Hitler was really happy, he turned into almost a comedian, like an old-timey comedian. He's slapping his knee. He's, slapping other guys on the back and stuff, and, talking about how this is amazing. So he's got the French trapped. Now
Nothing
it's time for
about that.
The Germans are basically about to just liquidate the French who are trapped in the pocket. And
so actually, to just break in for a second, given that with the understanding that these 2 reserve forces didn't have the best equipment, probably weren't the best trained, et cetera, what is the major advantage that the German army has at this point? Is it really the fact that they have that kind of unified command structure, that they have a kind of a different, battle discipline going on?
I'm glad you asked this, because I wrote up a whole sort of section about the French army and how it worked, and I just kind of glossed over it, but I'm actually happy you asked this. The French had sort of a system with how they categorized their men. The cream of the crop were these infantry divisions that they kept at full strength. Like, these were the best French men in their prime who had been trained, they were experienced. These men were all trapped in Belgium. So the French had to fill their reserve armies with what's called Type A and Type B conscripts. Type A and Type B conscripts were people who basically weren't good enough to be in the army the first time. They had maybe physical disabilities, like not full-on disabilities, but maybe they had a club foot, or their glasses, they had more glasses, or couldn't see really well, or were hard of hearing. Like they were the washouts, and these were the guys who were used to staff these reserve armies. And there's a quote from Edmund Allen Brooke, a British commander who was in France, and he said, as he walked by these conscripts, and he said this: "Men unshaven, horses ungroomed, clothes and saddlery that did not fit, vehicles dirty, and complete lack of pride in themselves or the unit. What shook me most, however, was the look in the men's faces, disgruntled and insubordinate looks.
Aside from describing me on a Monday morning, it would make sense then that, these enormous successes that basically unopposed advance that the Germans were having so far was in part because the Germans were throwing their best troops against, essentially troops that wouldn't have even been in the French army had they not been, desperately needed.
Yes, essentially. The Germans, again, going back to the whole Germans are really efficient trope, the Germans, every division was essentially the same. You had the same training, the men were generally the best. It did vary a bit, but generally speaking, every German could fight sort of at the same efficiency level. Not true with the French. These French reserve armies just melted away at points,
But at this point, of course, the Germans are now turning back to face the French troops that would be, like as you said, the cream of the crop.
Yes. The issue is, of course, that even the cream of the French crop still wasn't, it was about a match for the Germans, but consider now that they're hemmed in between the Germans coming down from the Netherlands and Belgium, the Germans who had crossed the River Meuse, and the Germans who had just sealed them off. So they're surrounded on three sides. For those of our listeners who may be more familiar with Alexander the Great and are familiar with the hammer and anvil tactics, basically Germany was about to, the tanks on the Somme were the anvil and the rest were the hammer. They were about to just smash, they would constrict and smash the French who were trapped in between them. And basically what happened was, this is when, the Somme is cut off. Basically, the French start panicking. People, the government, they panic. Large amounts of refugees clog the roads. The Allied armies have issues moving because there's so many refugees. And the French Prime Minister, a guy named Paul Reynaud, my apologies, he calls up Winston Churchill in the middle of the night. And he just utters this. He says, "We are defeated, we are beaten, we have lost the battle," and just hangs up. So Churchill's kind of now worried, so he immediately flies to Paris, and he meets with the French the French elites, the commanders of the army, the head prime ministers, and this is where that famous conversation happens. He asks Maurice Gamelin, the chief of defense, where is the strategic reserve to, sort of plug the Germans from advancing? And he just looks at Winston Churchill and he says, there is none.
Yeah, so that would be the two armies that were already smashed.
Yeah, they had no one left to plug the gap, so to speak. It's it. And so this is where the French start asking the British for more fighter squadrons and more help. Churchill says, yeah, I'll send them to you right away. But he leaves, and he's like, all right, guys, they're done.
Churchill, at this point, famously realpolitik, is already looking out for England at this point.
Yeah, he's like, as he's leaving, he actually does, to his credit, try and aid France. He does send some fighter squadrons, but he secretly knows that France is done, and he immediately institutes what's called Operation Dynamo, which is the Dunkirk evacuation. The Germans now are advancing into this pocket. The French are they're running out of supplies, so they're really easy to pick off. The British are basically done at this point. They're retreating towards Dunkirk, and the Germans begin hemming pockets in and taking them out sort of piecemeal. So they created a big pocket at the city of Calais, and they made that surrender. They trapped a bunch of French troops at a town called Lille, and they took them out. So one by one, the Germans are taking them out as the British are retreating. The only major British counterattack comes at Arras. The British take 2 infantry divisions and 2 tank brigades, and they try and take out Erwin Rommel, who is currently driving towards them. It's a very, I don't want to use the term successful, because that implies that it really, in the grand scheme of things, maybe changed something. It stops Rommel, but it doesn't make him lose any ground. It basically just delays him.
It is literally winning the battle, but losing, well, not eventually losing the war, but losing the war at that point.
Yeah, so they basically, that's it. The British realize, okay, we're done. So they go backwards.
So at this point, before the British are retreating, are the French retreating with them? Where are the French holding their positions?
The French, sort of. The French are fighting. The French are there's French who are trying to escape, and then there's the French who have been relegated to fighting a last-ditch battle to let them escape, sort of. But the French are still fighting. The French actually have a new plan now to deal with the Germans. Winston Churchill, in that meeting he had with the Parisian government and elites in Paris, he said this about the Germans: the tortoise has extended its head dangerously far from its shell. In other words, he thinks that for those who are familiar with the German strategy is the tanks go on ahead and they wait for the infantry to catch up. So he's thinking, the tanks are alone, we can cut them off and destroy them. And the French try this at several times, but they never work. For example, they tried one attack led by a future famous Frenchman, Charles de Gaulle. He's commander of an armored division, and he tries to attack the German corridor. The Germans had created a long corridor of sorts. He tries to attack it, but it doesn't work. Like, he doesn't make any headway. He's undersupplied. He doesn't have enough radios, doesn't have enough fuel or ammo, so he can't do anything. So that strategy doesn't work out. So now this is when the British are like, okay, everything's done, let's get out of here. So they retreat to Dunkirk, and on May 24th, Hitler issues his famous stop order, which is he orders his panzers to halt, and the British use that time, obviously, to escape in large numbers. So he issued it for a number of reasons. One, his tanks had been fighting nonstop since they crossed the border in May 12th. So that's almost, at this point, 2 weeks of unstopped fighting. So
the tanks are worn out, the men are worn out.
Yeah, the panzers, some units have as little as 50% of their tanks left. So he orders them to stop, and the area around Dunkirk that the British and French were sort of holding is really good defensive territory. There's a lot of canals, a lot of not good tank terrain. It's really not meant for tanks. So he issues that, and finally, probably the most influential factor is Hermann Goering assured Hitler that his Luftwaffe could stop any attempts by the British to escape. So, with all these in mind, Hitler orders them to stop. British do escape, but of course, they have to leave basically everything. They escape with their clothes on their back, and some Frenchmen even manage to escape as well. But
that is a topic unto itself when it comes down to it.
Yeah, that's the end of the northern pocket. That's it. Belgium fights on till May 28th, but they had to surrender because, what can they really do now at this point? They'd be left alone, so they surrender. And without getting too much into a Belgian history, the Belgian decision to surrender is very controversial because the Belgians actually kind of collaborated a bit with the Germans. Belgian king sort of aided the Germans. He acted as a figurehead almost for the Germans. So when the war is over, the Belgian king Leopold III would face a major crisis because he surrendered too early in people's minds. He should have kept fighting to the last man type thing.
So do we actually know if he was, without, again, keeping our focus on what we're doing, but just as an aside, do we actually know if Leopold III, and I should point out that there's King Leopold of Belgium tend to have a sordid history, but do we actually know if Leopold III was a bit of, a sympathizer or collaborator?
I think I would put Leopold III. And Leopold III was, of course, Belgium wasn't an absolute monarchy by any means. He had to listen to his elected officials, and he had an elected official, the chief of staff of the Belgian army. I guess he wasn't elected, but he was the chief of staff, was the one who was really pushing him. So I would put Leopold not necessarily in the collaborator so much more as I would put him in the man who saw the writing on the wall and sort of decided to make the best of a bad situation. Much like later on we'll get to Philippe Pétain, who also does this. So the French, because they weren't already sort of stuck in World War I, they decided to go further back, and they call for some old World War I heroes who had sort of saved them in the past, and so they kind of hoped that they could save them again. They call back two guys. They call back from Madrid a guy named Philippe Pétain to serve as the deputy prime minister. So in a sense, he was the number 2 man in the French government. And they call back the guy named Maxime Weygand from he was commanding troops in Syria and Lebanon. He was a French colony at the time. So he calls Weygand back to take over for Maurice Gamelin. Maurice Gamelin was the commander in chief we kept talking about. So Maurice Gamelin becomes head of the French armed forces, or Maxime Weygand replaces Maurice Gamelin. And Weygand now has a new strategy. He decides to build another fortified line along, just north of Paris in the hopes of sort of stopping the German advance. It's not really like a fortified line so much as it's called hedgehogs, which is essentially fortify every little village in the hopes of making the Germans bleed as much as possible. So the Germans now have the second part of their plan. Their first part of their plan, the liquidation of Belgium and all of that, was called Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow. So now they institute part 2 of their plan, which is called Fall Rot, or Case Red. This is basically the end of France. We got France on the ropes. We're going to just finish them off. The war's over. Everyone can go home. So basically, the French, the Germans advance into this Weygand line. The Weygand line does do its job. There's reports of, the French start to fight fanatically now because Paris is right there. So they start fighting fanatically, and they put up a tremendous resistance considering the situation they're in. But there's nothing they can do. Erwin Rommel penetrates the line at one of its ends, and so this wouldn't have been disastrous if the French had reinforcements to plug the gap, but again, they have no one left, so Erwin Rommel basically runs straight through the gap. The gaps open up in other places, and the Weygand line is done. French government evacuates to Bordeaux and declares Paris an open city, so that on June 14th...
So wait, what does it mean that Paris is an open city? Just that it's no longer defended?
Yeah, no longer defended, don't bomb it, when you the only cities that get declared open are historic centers. So Rome was declared an open city when the Allies invaded Italy. That's the only other example I can think of at the moment. But basically,
but it's the idea that we won't defend this, and you won't destroy this.
Yeah, you won't just bomb it for fun, right? So, the Paris falls on June 14th. No resistance offered. The Germans, Paris, at this point, the French people are done. They don't want to fight anymore. They realize they've lost. It's the people in Paris open for business as usual. Cafes open. The Germans they basically treat the Germans like customers. They just say, you guys do what you want to do. Just let us live our lives. And for the most part, that was how the occupation of France would go, basically. Leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. So
it's, in hindsight, of course, World War II is this, momentous, huge battle between, forces of absolute good and forces of absolute evil.
Yeah.
But what did the French actually think was going to happen, upon, the fall of Paris? What, or even... when, as we know, they would eventually surrender, what was their idea of what was going to happen? Was it more informed by the 1870 Franco-Prussian War? What was their conception of the future under German occupation?
They didn't actually think the occupation would probably last that long. And actually, the German occupation only lasted so long, would only last as long as Britain lasted. Because the German post-war plans are hard to sort of understand, because I like to use the analogy that they're impossible to understand because every guy and his grandmother had a plan going to happen. So it's really hard to understand.
Of course, there was one guy whose plan was a little more important.
See, that's the thing though. Hitler, they never. Whereas the East was settled, everyone knew what was going to happen in the East: starvation, then colonization. The West got debated. Hitler didn't even take too much of an interest in it. It was, it was just everyone kind of had their own opinions. So, anyways, the German plan, and this was stated clearly in the Armistice, which we'll get to later, was we'll occupy the important parts that we need to make Britain surrender. Then we're going to hand it all back to the legal French government, except for the few areas that are really German that you guys took from us in the First World War. We're going to take that back. Yeah, and yeah, so
which just as an aside, if any of you have ever had an Alsatian white wine or Alsatian Riesling in particular, delicious. Back to you.
Well, I'm sure the Germans thought so. Anyways, on June 10th, 4 days before Paris falls, Germany gets a new ally. Mussolini, seeing that Mussolini doesn't want to be left out, so Mussolini declares war on the French and the British, and he wants Mussolini only. This is again a topic for a separate podcast, but I should just point out Mussolini isn't ready for war, but he only wants in because he doesn't think the war's going to last long. He thinks the war's over in a month, so he just wants to say, I contributed.
Yeah,
the problem is
we've already won, so let me get on your side.
Yeah. So the problem is the French and the Italians share a border in only one area in Europe along the Alps, and the French had extensive fortifications on the Alps. Like, they were major. They were called the Little Maginot Line.
But of course they had the advantage of being in the Alps.
Yes, and in addition to the giant mountains, they also have, some of the biggest fortifications in Europe. So the Italians basically just throw themselves into the east thinking they'll retreat or, they'll be thinly garrisoned. No, so in one of probably the most lopsided battles in history, the French lose 8 men, 2 dead, 6 wounded. The Italians lose 5,000 men killed, and the Italians managed to gain a whopping 2 kilometers of ground. And there's a amusing little anecdote that Mussolini had to actually ask for German transport aircraft to land some of his men behind the French lines so that he could say, I did something.
So this, I guess at this point, thus begins the long tradition of Italy being a bigger drain on German resources than fighting actual Allied forces.
Yes, very much. This is a sign of things to come. So with Paris captured and the Italians, the Italians fighting now too, Paul Reynaud, the Prime Minister of France, he resigns and gives it to Philippe Pétain. Philippe Pétain had wanted an armistice for a while, so now that he's in power, he calls for one. And he sends it to the Nazis, and the Nazis are basically, all right, we'll do this, because by this point the German panzers are just running through. There's no one left. There's literally no soldiers left. So German panzers are just anywhere they feel like it, essentially. The French want an armistice, and Germany says, this is the perfect chance to get them back from Versailles. Like, we're gonna laugh at them, we're gonna humiliate them. They go so symbolic. They get the same train car that the French had, that the Treaty of Versailles had been signed in. They go to the same spot. They go to a small area called Compiègne. It's a small patch of forest, and it's called Compiègne. They meet there. They get the same train cart. Hitler sits in the same chair that Ferdinand Foch, the French delegate, had sat in the First World War. And as soon as the French delegation arrives, they read their preamble, so their little statement saying, we've lost this, what are your terms? Hitler doesn't wait for them. Hitler, as soon as they finish speaking, he gets up, he leaves, and goes back to Germany. Basically, that's exactly what Ferdinand Foch did to the Germans.
so incredibly
he's
symbolic
basically mirroring. Yeah, he's being almost childish in a way. He's basically saying, you guys got to do this, now it's our turn.
Wait, are you telling me that Hitler may not have been a good man? No, but I can understand that there's this idea of that. And actually, I'm glad you brought this up, because I did read a very large and authoritative biography of Hitler, which mentioned this very prominently as being, kind of a burning desire of his to, Hitler being this kind of, master of the grandiose gesture of, and also a World War I veteran, as wanting to kind of repay the French for the embarrassment of the Germans.
Yeah. But it was also almost a little bit of a dilemma, because he really respected Philippe Pétain, because, Hitler thought of himself as some great grizzled old soldier. So he recognized another grizzled old soldier, and he said, we're both soldiers, but in the end, his respect for Pétain was so far outweighed by his hate for the French that he said, sorry, we still got to screw you over. Basically, the terms imposed on France were so much more harsher, were really harsh. Like, they were harsher than Versailles could ever have been. So the Germans have occupied all territory that touched an Atlantic or touched the Atlantic coast, and even a bit deeper in. They occupied most of the major French cities, leaving this rump state to be governed from Vichy. The Germans required that the French Navy be disarmed. They required that the French maintain an army of no larger than 100,000 men. The French had to pay indemnities to the tune of, I believe it was 300 million francs. And they also had to pay for the upkeep costs of German troops on French soil, which was another 400 million francs a day. So France was done. And France, it seems like a harsh armistice, but, like, you're kind of wondering, why would France accept this? This turns them into, a minor state in Europe, but they really had nothing to do. It was either that or just face full occupation. And another interesting story is that Winston Churchill didn't want this armistice to be signed. So what he did was he sent, this is going back to before Reynaud resigned and Philippe Pétain was still deputy, but Churchill had sent, believe it or not, an offer to the French government to unite the two countries into one.
So Churchill is prime minister at this point, correct?
Yes. Churchill became prime minister about, I'm not sure on the exact date, but it was about the time the Germans pushed through the Ardennes. So Neville Chamberlain's government had collapsed. So Churchill sends them an offer to merge the two countries, but the French want to be independent. So
yeah, that's really interesting. What would have been the actual outcome if this kind of merger of France and the United Kingdom had happened? Would Britain would have they then moved more troops back in?
It was not an equal union by any means. Britain would have definitely been the dominant partner in the union. Like, the French would have had to adopt the British monarchy. It was definitely not an equal union. It was definitely hey, you guys suck now, so why don't you come join our large empire?
But I mean, I guess, yeah, I can see how that might not have worked with the French. But I can, although, it's 1066 in reverse. So, but I can see how, that would not be appealing to the French. But was it taken seriously at all? Was there the promise that, like, hey, if you do accept yourselves as, basically part of the United Kingdom, we'll send troops back to France? What was the thinking behind this?
Paul Reynaud, the French prime minister at the time that the offer was sent, was actually sort of in favor of it, because he really did not like Germany. He wanted to keep fighting no matter what, but everyone else was really opposed to it, including Philippe Pétain. Philippe Pétain held the sort of dominant view that was held by many others that, okay, Germany just kicked our asses. What do you think they're going to do to your little island, right? Philippe Pétain said, it's not, like 100% sure if this actually happened, but there's reports that Pétain allegedly said to Churchill, Germany is going to wring your neck like a chicken in the next few weeks. He blamed the British for abandoning France. He hated the British now. He was anti-British right now.
And so as far as the, I guess the main idea of the French discourse at this point was, look, France has fallen, England, you're next. You might as well make a deal while we can. Yeah,
that was it. And that's also figures into resistance. That's the reason why the Germans didn't really have to deal with large-scale resistance until 1943, 1944, because everyone simply thought, they're going to win. What's the point? Might as well just make it easier on ourselves. So that was the dominant view of the French. There was one war hawk though, Charles de Gaulle. He fled to Britain. Well, didn't flee. He was sent to sort of be an emissary of sorts, like a go between the French and the British. But he was trapped there when the French surrendered. So he delivered his famous de Gaulle's appeal on CBC radio, or BBC radio, I should say.
Somebody's Canadian. Or not.
Yes. Anyways, he met on BBC radio, and he basically said, all true Frenchmen will fight on. Most did not agree with him. He rallied around, around 3,000 followers. Immediately defected to him. Most stayed loyal to Vichy.
But would this be the kind of the core of the French resistance that would come later?
Yes. This for a while would be France's own. The core supporters came from the French troops that had gotten away at Dunkirk, and these would be France's only white troops for actually until D-Day, when the French landed. The Free French were able to start recruiting again. So these would really be the only French white troops. Any other French troops would come from their colonies. So
that's really interesting. Do we know kind of like a percentage-wise ratio of, French European versus, French, non-European troops?
It would be hard to nail down, but generally speaking, before the French landed, it would have probably been something in the neighborhood of 80 to 90% colonial, 10% white. And then even the colonies didn't immediately respond to de Gaulle's appeal. A small area in Central Africa, the French Congo, immediately went over to de Gaulle. But after that, de Gaulle had to sort of fight tooth and nail to get any colonies, even little ones like small islands off the coast of Canada that were still French. Still, de Gaulle basically begged them to go over to his side. The Free French movement was not as popular. It did not become really popular until 1943, 1944. But yes, so de Gaulle's appeal, the French basically. So, anyways, back to mainland France. France sort of is done. France signs the Armistice. The war is over. And taking stock, the French had lost 90,000 men killed and tons more wounded and captured. Well, the Germans...
Yeah, well, in retrospect, knowing from, hindsight, that seems like a very tiny portion of, the 50 million people who eventually, or more, I would actually think, that actually died in World War II. But I guess at that point, that was serious losses.
Yes, especially when you consider that what happened to the majority of the French troops is that they'd either captured or they just kind of melted away. So they weren't really dead, but they weren't fighting anymore. The Germans is almost pathetically low. They only lost 27,000 dead, which was just amazing when you consider that they'd basically taken out their main rival. With Germany, with the French dead, not dead, the French taken out, the British began preparing. They tried one little last half-hearted attempt. They landed the 1st Canadian Infantry Division, which was really the only actual division they had left. They landed them in western France, but France surrendered, so they immediately basically just turned tail and left. And so the British start preparing for their inevitable siege that's going to come. As Churchill put it in his famous quotes, "What General Weygand called the Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin." The French, meanwhile, began to sort of wonder. The French, now that the initial shock is over, they're thinking to themselves, how the heck did this happen? Like, weren't we supposed to be like, our generals had been telling us that our army was good. Our politicians said we would never surrender. What the heck just happened? Like, and then, so everyone starts kind of looking for scapegoats. This is where politics comes into issue. French politics had always been very divisive. So, if you were a liberal, you lost because the conservative elite had screwed you over. If you were a communist, it was because the bourgeoisie had betrayed you. If you were a conservative, you lost because communist sympathizers. And it just started getting ridiculous. Like, there was a political cartoon that blamed France's loss on, get this, homosexual writers.
Well, I mean, clearly. I mean, that's what brought down the Roman Empire, I believe.
It was literally just like the political cartoon was literally like young men of France had been corrupted by these homosexual writers, and it's just like, you can tell they're trying to fix their prestige when, they're blaming it on these types of people, right?
Well, in a way, it seems understandable because, we're having this podcast now, we're talking because I think, like I said, at the beginning, this is a section of history which really kind of, in light of the much larger scope and global reach of World War II, the fall of France seems almost like a footnote at the beginning that says, yeah, and then France fell really quickly. So it seems like the French themselves were grappling with that in real time.
Yeah, it was I definitely, that's the reason I wanted to do this topic over any other topic. Also, besides the fact that it's probably one of the few areas of World War II that can easily fit in a nice little podcast episode. Like, you can't do all of the Eastern Front in one episode.
Yeah,
but
we could do Dunkirk in one episode.
But it's a nice sort of area to fit in. But it's just everyone sort of forgets about it and almost skips. France is included with the likes of Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, for those countries that sort of just surrendered. Like, people just go, in 1939, 1940, Hitler's Blitzkrieg took over all of Western Europe, and that's it. And then the Battle of Britain gets like 6 hours of TV time, while the fall of France gets like a half hour with commercial breaks. So it's definitely such an overlooked part, and it's important because, with all the references to World War I, the Battle of France is what kept this war from becoming another World War I. This is what made, Hitler's conquest of, invasion of Russia possible. Like, all those defining, the Battle of Britain was made possible. All those defining features of World War II wouldn't have been possible without this monumental battle. But it's basically become a sort of a footnote in, all the battles that had happened in World War II, and it's rather unfortunate because it is a very interesting topic.
So to put a cap on this conversation, we have at some point, of course, as we mentioned earlier, de Gaulle comes back to France and leads the French resistance. So what is the outcome that leads us to essentially that event? So France has been conquered. What then happens? How does the French resistance and eventually the French liberation how do those wheels start spinning?
So anyways, what happens is de Gaulle does his appeal. The small areas begin to sort of come off to de Gaulle. The first French, I can't remember the exact order, but first French Central Africa, then Chad comes over, and then small islands in the Pacific. So his movement starts to gain a little bit of steam. But the main areas like Indochina is seized by the Japanese. North Africa doesn't actually go over until the Germans sort of force their hand. So basically the French start to gain steam. The Allies massively supply de Gaulle's Free France movement. Like, America sends so much lend-lease towards Free France, like uniforms, weapons. The Free French, basically, the only thing that's French about them is the men. And even then,
as we said, they're not exactly all French.
There's very little that's actually French about these Free French. There's nothing they produce, So that they get massively supplied, and then what happens is Germany begins to strip away its own political support. Initially, the communists actually had been supportive of Germany, but that, they were the first political group to start opposing Germany because, they invaded the only communist nation on earth. So,
okay, can we really say that, I mean, this is probably a huge question for another podcast, but can we really say that France was communist at this point? Oh,
no,
are we
France
talking about the Soviet Union?
Yes, okay, France wasn't communist. I don't mean to say that. I mean more just, there's various political groups. France is really much divided among political lines. So Germany initially tries to sort of keep the political groups on their side. But the first ones they lose are the communists. The communists go over, then the communist young men in the cities begin to stream into the countryside. They start to form their little partisan bands. Then, naturally, they just begin to lose the rest of French society as they become, harsher in terms of occupation. And as I discussed earlier, Germany begins to lose the war in 43 and 44.
Well, one could say that, with the election of Hitler, in 33, they had lost the war.
Yes. Anyways, 43, 44, they start to lose the war. So naturally, that's when people go, hey, let's get some revenge. The Allies will be here in a year now. So let's get some revenge. That's when people start to stream into the countryside to join these groups of the Marquis and the various little French resistance groups. And they all start fighting against the German occupation. Some cases even fighting amongst themselves with those political divisions coming back. Meanwhile, de Gaulle is gaining strength through his African and his other areas slowly start defecting to him, to the point where Free France almost is able to launch its own invasion of their homeland in what's called Operation Dragoon, which is a small, basically Americans and the Free French invaded the south of France. And then, of course, in 1944, de Gaulle would lead his men in a triumphant march into Paris. So that was how France got its liberation.
So with the marching of de Gaulle into Paris in 1944, it kind of puts an end cap on the idea of the battle of France, the battle for France, and the victory of France with the Allies. But we still have this idea about France as this capitulatory force that then, Vichy France then collaborated or, surrendered to and was a puppet of the Nazis. So just as kind of a final question, is that really a fair, just to ask, for an opinion, of course, an assessment, but an informed opinion, is that really a fair view of this time period?
I think that it's obviously a trope. France is not, a surrender. France, going back into French history, they've been very brave fighters. Very, they'd been one of the European superpower for the longest time. So and specifically with World War II, we're looking at them. They were just so outmatched. Like it's unfair to look like. Think of how much effort was expended in fighting Germany. Like, they managed to last a year trapped between the Soviets and the Western Allies, and they still managed to fight that battle for a year. So it was just, if we look at the fall of France and say, they fell in 2 weeks, they must be really easy to surrender. It's just, it's unfair to them considering you're expecting them to fight the most dominant European country at that point with essentially no support, because the British, the British were the naval power. They couldn't really do much in terms of army. So it was essentially, the Battle of France was essentially a French-German showdown, which the Germans had, won in 1870 and almost won in 1914. So, I mean, it wasn't really a great shock that France had fallen, rather that they'd just fallen so quickly. Germany was definitely the powerhouse. Yes, it is unfair to characterize France as a surrender monkey. They did put up a good fight, but they were outmatched. You're asking like the lion, the zebra to essentially take out the lion.
Well,
really
now
searching.
Now that we've ended on a note that will piss off any Frenchmen who listen to this. Although zebras are very stylish.
Yes.
So there is that. So thank you, AC, for talking to us about this kind of very overlooked period of history and kind of shedding some light onto it. We'll put this up, and if anyone has any comments that they would like to, or clarifications that they'd like, or to say that the French actually are surrender monkeys, or the French are ferocious lions, you can do that in the discussion page. We'll put it up. So thank you, AC.
Yes, thank you. I look forward to being back soon, hopefully.
And as always, thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this podcast as much as I did, particularly covering as it does a much maligned piece of history. If you didn't have your mind changed on something, hopefully you at least learned something, or if you're already an expert, hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I did doing it. So next week, or next fortnight actually, that will be August the 1st. Our next episode will be with David AOP and the illustrious Eternal Carey, covering the golden age of piracy. Hope to hear you then.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.